Well, there's growing concern tonight about the explosion in ADHD diagnosis and whether some Australians are being labelled too quickly and too easily. The Herald Sun reports leading experts, including Professor Edward Ogden, fear the condition is being overdiagnosed in expensive, privately run clinics. They warn some practices are offering fast tracked online assessments with little follow up or care, while charging hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars per patient. Professor Ogden says that while ADHD is genuine and often life changing diagnosis, commercial pressures may be distorting the process, with too many people being medicated unnecessarily. He and other experts are now calling for tougher standards, more training for doctors, and better oversight of private clinics. To find out more, the professor is joining me. Professor Edward Ogden, welcome to McKnight Tonight.
Thank you very much.
Now, you are suggesting we are witnessing an overdiagnosis trend. How big do you think the problem is becoming in Australia?
I actually have no idea. I don't think we have really good figures. We know that ADHD is being diagnosed more often, particularly in adults, than it has been in the past, which could be a really good thing because there are people whose lives are dramatically changed by correct diagnosis and treatment.
And for the
Um,
record, I am one of them. And I can tell you from personal experience, there was a lot I didn't understand about myself until I had that diagnosis.
yeah, I think the commonest thing I hear from people when you get it right is it's transformative.
Absolutely.
Um, uh,
Like it's cost me employment, not understanding why I do or did the things that I did and the way I did them. So I'm intrigued as to, you say you don't know how big this problem is. What are you basing it on? What do you think is leading to this overdiagnosis?
well, I guess look, the overdiagnosis question is one that's been raised by others. My concern is, in fact, the reverse, that there are some people who desperately need help who can't get it.
Right.
Um, the public mental health system almost universally will not treat ADHD, um, even when it's very obvious. And so what this means is that we have this social equity issue that if you've got enough money and you can afford one of the private clinics, then you can get a diagnosis, rightly or wrongly. But if you don't have the money, then it's almost impossible. And the obvious problem that I have is that I may make the diagnosis of ADHD for someone who's in drug and alcohol rehabilitation and successfully commence them on treatment. But then when they leave the area of my practice, I can't find anyone to take them on. Psychiatrists won't treat people who have a history of drug use. And there is almost no public clinic to which I can refer people. So I see this as a huge social equity issue. Because
This
as
is
you rightly
interesting to
said, Rob, I
me
mean,
because
people's lives are changed when you get the diagnosis right.
absolutely. And so it's interesting because the way it obviously came across in the article was that you were basically saying, or the experts, the way that article was written was it sounded to me like, oh, well, basically people just want a diagnosis and they go and pay for it. I don't think just because you spend all that money, you should be given a diagnosis, but I really
Couldn't
take
agree
your
more.
point. And I think you have a really good point that in this country, mental illness, mental health of any kind is problematic if you don't have the money to go and pay for psychologists and psychiatrists to go and get the help you need. And then there's a waiting list of 6 months or 8 months or a year sometimes.
Yeah, I think it was, nicely highlighted by the Royal Commission into Mental Health in Victoria, which talked about the forgotten middle, that
Yep.
there are people who are, really profoundly unwell, who are looked after by the public health system, particularly the acute public health system. And there are people whose problems aren't perhaps quite as dramatic, whose problems are reasonably well managed by their general practitioner. And there's this group in the middle who are pretty difficult for a GP to manage and yet aren't sick enough for the public system to look after, and they miss out. That's what the Royal Commission referred to as the forgotten middle. And I think with ADHD, this is a huge issue. That there are people whose lives could be transformed by appropriate treatment but can't access it.
Yeah, indeed. And so the article also spoke about more diagnosis. Does that come from us being more informed? When I was a kid, if you ever saw a story on a current affair, it was ADHD, kids out of control, and it was one of those things, hyperactivity, and you didn't want to be one of those. But we've obviously learnt a
Yeah.
lot more about it now. And as a kid, I never would have thought I was ADHD, but I look back now and realize I absolutely was. So this is a loaded question. Is there more diagnosis because we're more informed, or are we looking for excuses?
And could both of those things be true simultaneously?
Sure.
That, I think like all other human characteristics, there's a range, and there are people whose ADHD, if we stick with that diagnosis, is so obviously out of control that, I mean, I spoke to a young man in rehabilitation earlier this year who said he was expelled from kindergarten. So that's a really extreme
Yeah.
example of a little person whose life is severely handicapped by their behaviour. And at the other extreme, you've got people who say, well, I'm a bit forgetful, or, I'm a bit impulsive, and I'm a bit fidgety. Could I have ADHD? Well, yeah, lots of us have got some aspects of ADHD. We don't all need medication.
So what's the
Um,
balance here?
well, I think it's about it, as you said in your introduction, it's about education and awareness. Um, even if you make the diagnosis that somebody has ADHD, they don't necessarily need to be medicated. Um, that if they're forgetful, they can use compensatory behaviors. They, use the calendar apps on their phone. Set reminders. Fidget spinners are designed for people who can't sit still. Um, it is a matter of, are these characteristics which you have causing significant disability in your life? And if they're not, well, that's interesting. You're a bit forgetful, you're a bit fidgety, whatever. But when you get people who say, look, I've started 10 courses, but I haven't completed anything. I just can't concentrate. I can't do anything. I mean, for me, I think if you get a child at, 16, 17 who says, I just aren't, can't concentrate in the classroom, that's kind of an urgent problem to help them get their life in order, because, their last year or two at school is crucial.
Mm.
It's not as simple as, we overdiagnose or underdiagnose the condition. It's a matter of being thoughtful about the individual and what have we got to offer that may or may not improve your life.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Your group is calling for more training and national standards for ADHD assessments. What specific reforms would make the biggest difference right now?
Well, you see, they're there. It requires, that the ADHD Professionals Association has published um, ADHD diagnostic guidelines for Australia. And we've published treatment guidelines, which have been approved by the National Health and Medical Research Council. So, I mean, the guidelines are there. You know, I have colleagues who have developed courses for training GPs. I help run a course for training psychiatrists. I mean, training is there. But part of it is that, every state and territory is a little different in how they allow access to particularly the psychostimulants.
Yes.
New South Wales and Western Australia have announced they're going to allow GPs to prescribe, but they haven't said anything about which GPs or, do the GPs need some training? I mean, certainly what we've talked about in various ways is that, people prescribing, let's say if we allow GPs to prescribe for ADHD, then they should belong to some sort of peer review group, maybe including a psychiatrist, so that there's some some ongoing thought goes into, are we doing the best thing for these people, not just throwing drugs at them?
That's a very interesting point. And look, from my own personal experience, I am prescribed Ritalin. I don't always take it. If I'm doing a lot of stuff at home, I tend to try, I don't want to be on drugs my whole life. And so I do go off them, and that can sometimes be a bad thing, and I will then get back on them. But I do find Ritalin helps, and I get worried when I see headlines. I get worried that we're now being negative towards people who are being diagnosed with ADHD because it's the big fad. I don't know if it's a bigger problem than it was before. I don't know what's changed. I know from personal experience that diagnosis was life-changing. And when I am on Ritalin, that is life-changing. So I do get concerned that we head down this path of saying, well, we're diagnosing too much, we need to pull it back, but we need to, in my opinion, make sure we pull it back in the right way, making sure the right people still get the diagnosis, don't we?
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, you can think about this in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think the people with ADHD were probably the hunter-gatherers of thousands of years ago. They were busy. They had to be running around all over the place. They couldn't sit still. Yeah,
that we didn't have phones to distract us then.
Well, and you weren't expected to sit in a classroom or to sit at a desk in a workplace. If you felt like, running off and doing something, no one cared. So, some of it may be an artifact of our modern lifestyle. I mean, I don't know, but what I do see is that if you get the diagnosis right and you get the treatment right, you can see people's lives just transformed from a sense of years and years of being labeled as a failure, you're lazy, you're stupid, to actually, I can achieve things.
Yeah.
One of the first people that, no one taught me this stuff when I was a medical student or as a young doctor. I mean, I've learnt this stuff the hard way and largely from my peer review group. But, one of the first people who I recognised had ADHD as the underpinning of her drug addiction. When I met her, she started and failed 10 courses. The last time I saw her, she was finishing a bachelor's degree. I mean, treatment can be truly transformative and allow people to achieve their true potential. And we know 30% of people in a drug and alcohol clinic have ADHD. It's, depending on which estimate you look at, but 30% of the prison population. I mean, we could allow people to live more fulfilled lives if we get the diagnosis and treatment right. And it's not just drugs,
Sorry, you can tell I haven't had the Ritalin. I'm jumping in. I'm very excited to talk to you.
That's one of the signs, isn't it? Interrupting others when they're talking.
One final thing that I just want to go back to. You said something and it's been playing on my mind. I think you said psychiatrists won't take on patients who've had drug addictions. That's very concerning because presumably I would imagine they're the people who really need help. Are you telling me it is a real situation where psychiatrists won't take those people on as patients?
The commonest thing I hear is, I won't treat you till you've been, 3 months, 6 months, whatever, drug-free. Whereas my clinical experience as an addiction medicine practitioner is that as soon as you treat the ADHD, people stop using drugs.
Yeah. Well, you hear that a lot of people with ADHD use drugs because the stimulant brings them down. It's funny. I try to explain to people with the Ritalin is that it could give you a high, but it evens me out. It has the opposite effect. But it's fascinating.
Well, we know a lot about the neurobiology of that, but basically the ADHD brain is very, very busy. There's lots of things going on. Beautifully described to me by one of my patients a year or so ago who said it's like walking into Harvey Norman and there's a wall of television stations and they're all on different channels and they've all got the volume up and you don't know where to look. If you take your medication, you can pick the one you want to concentrate on.
It's funny. I love that. I'll be here because this is my office as well as my studio. and my wife will come in and I've got audio playing over there as I'm watching news websites. I'm editing here and I've got audio going. She's going, how can you deal with all this noise? I'm like, it's good for me. Professor Ogden, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure.
And to me, the biggest takeout is we need to make sure that those who can't afford it can get the diagnosis. I understand everything else you're saying, but that's a big takeout for me.
Well, I think that, look, to me, that's the biggest issue, is this equity issue. You know, I don't know of another addiction practice in the country that treats ADHD as a primary activity other than the one we run here in Shepparton. And that strikes me as being very sad. And so, you know, that's very much part of the way I feel, is this is a huge equity issue. You know, we're constantly approached by people saying, I don't have a drug and alcohol problem, but could you treat my ADHD? And the answer, of course, is no, that's not what we're here for. So yeah, it's a huge equity issue, and you know, it's one I think that, you know, requires a policy response. I mean, general practitioners very competently treat lots of mental health issues. When it gets too hard, they call on a psychiatrist. I don't see why ADHD should be any different. It's not in Canada. In Canada, it's treated by ADHD, by GPs, and the rate of ADHD in Canada is no higher than it is in the United States. So it's not as if you can't trust GPs or they're going to overdiagnose.
I agree.
In fact, it's probably the other way around. People will feel a bit uncertain in an area that they're not very comfortable in, and so they'll maybe slow to make the diagnosis.
Very good point. Professor Ogden, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure.
Fun, insightful interviews from a washed-up producer with nothing to lose. McKnight Tonight, McKnight Tonight, McKnight Tonight. It's good enough.